Tonight we celebrate the Feast of the Lord's Supper, this Holy Thursday, the institution of the Holy Eucharist, this most sacred priesthood, and a call for a remembrance of fraternal charity. This evening is a sentimental evening for me personally. My spiritual director and spiritual father, Monsignor Anthony LaFemina, I know many of our priests know Monsignor, we're coming up on his third year, his anniversary of his passing. This coming December will be the third year of his passing. But Monsignor LaFemina spent the greater portion of his priesthood in preparing for a book to write in regards to the foot washing, the Gospel of John. His book is entitled The Eucharist and Covenant in John's Last Supper Account. And Monsignor spent a great part of his life immersed in John chapter 13, specifically these chapter and verses. And he would just dive deep into the depths of the covenant language that was being used, the symbolism that was being used. So listening to this reading tonight was, in my mind, if you could imagine a piece of steel being drug across flint. You know, each time it hit a bump, there was a new spark, and it just brings so much love in my own heart to remember all of those conversations Monsignor and I would have. He would share with me as we would sit around the dinner table, just different elements of what's going on here in this gospel and how rich it is. And one of the things that Monsignor, the Monsignor point that I will give us this evening, was that John is always trying to reveal a deep and mystical hidden meaning within not only his language, but in the mystery of Christ given to us through his gospel. And so there's always these layers. The Gospel of St. John is kind of like a lasagna, excuse the expression, but there are just different layers, and the further you go, the deeper and more rich it can become. One of the points that Monsignor would always reiterate to me was the deep connection between Holy Thursday and Good Friday. This inseparable connection between the two services, the liturgical services. Specifically in the context, you can see this continuum from Holy Thursday to Good Friday, because in our conclusion of our Holy Thursday service, there is no official end, so to speak. We have the concluding prayer, and then we have the repose of the Blessed Sacrament to the altar of reserve in Rosan Hall, and then we all depart in silence. Tomorrow's Good Friday service does not begin with the customary sign of the cross, but rather it begins with the priests prostrating themselves here on the floor, and then going directly into the opening prayer. What Monsignor always was trying to illuminate in my mind and heart was this deep mystical connection of what is happening here on Good Thursday and the connection to Good Friday. And it's what the church has always taught, is that on Holy Thursday at the Last Supper, this is not just a mere meal where, like Thanksgiving, where we're passing the baked potatoes or whatnot, but rather this is the liturgical meal of the Jewish people, this Passover meal. And what Jesus does in the midst of the Last Supper is he makes his body, blood, soul, and divinity the institution of the Most Holy Eucharist, and then in turn the institution of the sacred orders of the ministerial priesthood. And in a mystical way, Christ makes the substantial realities of Calvary present at the Last Supper prior to the external manifestation the next day on Good Friday. And so mystically, Calvary is made present at the Last Supper with only the external ceremony to be carried out the next day. These words are reflected in our second reading today, where we see in 1 Corinthians that 1 Corinthians chapter 11, St. Paul says, "For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Again, in John chapter 13, part of that alliteration, the language John uses, Jesus laid aside his outer garment. This is his death on the cross. Again, his outer garment is his humanity. His divinity never dies. So he lays down his outer garment, his humanity, death on the cross. But then when Jesus takes up and re-robes himself, akin to the resurrection, the symbolic language of John. And so again, we see in the Last Supper, Calvary made present. We also see this reflected in the Divine Mercy Diary given to us by St. Faustina. This is paragraph 684, which I will read to you in its entirety. St. Faustina says, Thursday, During this hour of prayer, Jesus allowed me to enter the upper room, and I was witness to what happened there. However, I was deeply moved when, before the consecration, Jesus raised his eyes to heaven and entered into a mysterious conversation with his Father. It is only in eternity that we shall really understand that moment. His eyes were like two flames. His face was radiant, white as snow. His whole personage full of majesty, his soul full of longing. At the moment of consecration, love rested sated. The sacrifice fully consummated. Now only the external ceremony of death will be carried out, external destruction. The essence of it is in the upper room. Never in my whole life have I understood this mystery so profoundly as I did during that hour of adoration. How ardently I desire the whole world to come to know this unfathomable mystery. And so what the church has always taught is that what we celebrate in our regular masses after the resurrection of Jesus Christ makes present Calvary past after the fact. But what Jesus does at the Last Supper is make Calvary present in advance. We see that in this moment 2,000 years ago, we have not only the institution of the most blessed sacrament in the Eucharist, but also the ministerial priesthood. So today it's aptly so that the church celebrates the anniversary of all priests in remembrance of this. Holy Church asks us not only on this day to reflect upon these two institution moments, but also upon fraternal charity. And it's in the spirit of this homily that I want to draw more in on that substantial reality of fraternal charity. A lot of times people think fraternal charity is a matter of external actions, and there's truth in that statement. But rather, fraternal charity has to begin from within, and it has to reflect from our substantial identity, specifically for us priests. Who do we identify with and as? An easy way to say this, I'll say this in simple terms, and then I'll get into the weeds of this. But very simply, when we talk about identity versus doing, being versus behavior, we can talk about our prayer lives. Are we men and women of prayer, or are we men and women who pray? There's a fundamental distinction of a person who prays and a person of prayer. A person of prayer, it's so deeply ingrained in their life and even into their character that if there's a day that goes by that they don't have that opportunity for quality time in prayer, some richness of prayer, there's always something lacking and missing. But rather, a person who prays can be hit and miss in their prayer life. And again, if you ask me, which am I can respond very simply, it depends on the moment. You know, there are certain days that I am definitely a man of prayer, that I'm more consistently that than otherwise. But there are other times I find myself slipping, just saying prayers, going through the motions of my prayers. And I use that as a thermometer to correct myself and bring myself back. So as it comes to fraternal charity, specifically as results in the priesthood, where do we base our fraternal charity from? Well, it comes from the very divine essence of Jesus Christ. Archbishop Fulton Sheen, in the latter years of his life, he would give different days of recollections and work with priests and seminarians. And the one theme that he would always come back to would be priest as sacrifice. He would have 2 points. One, priest as sacrifice, and then always encouraging the people to make that daily holy hour. And it's amazing, in this man's whole career, of all of the topics that he covered, at the end of his life, those are the 2 that he continues to come back to. Priest as sacrifice should be our very identity as priests, recognizing that it is constantly living out this sense of internal desolation, this internal laying down of our lives for the sake of others. This is reflected in the vows that we take as religious, the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. To give up our own free will, to give up the opportunity for our own family, our own decision-making in certain regards, as well as the opportunity for the material goods of this world. Again, we start there as a perpetual living out, but do we interiorize that life of Christ even deeper? And this is a point of reflection for each of us. When we look at the world that we have today, The world today wants to say fraternal charity is meeting people where they are. It's accompanying people wherever they happen to be. You're going to hear this a lot if you watch any YouTube homilies, that all are welcome. Well, there's truth in those statements. Again, that's the devil uses every lie. Everything the devil says has some truth in it normally. But when we look at this concept that all are welcome and that we must accompany people in their sinfulness, this is a great challenge in that statement, because when we look at what the church has always done is, yes, the church has always been the first one out the door to meet people where they are, but always to invite them to change their lives, to make changes in their life, to conform themselves to Christ. It's never been in the history of the church where the church has wanted to change its ways to accommodate the world, but rather it's Christ who asked the world to make changes so that the world can accommodate him in their lives. And so it's this opportunity for us to reject all notions of abandoning authentic divine revelation, authentic worship, divine revelation and natural law in order to walk in the ways of sinners, to try to kind of sell them the faith by giving it up. Again, no one wants to buy what you've just laid down. And so we have this call for authenticity and integrity in our living out the truths of the church. And this is done through, one, knowing our faith, studying our faith, finding our identity in the divine revelation of Jesus Christ, but also the natural law that God has given us in the world that we see today. Again, rejecting these false notions of worldliness, so to speak. For priests as sacrifice, it's not just to focus on the doing acts of charity, but to truly live it out in every moment of our life. One of my favorite quotes in modern time is, "Character is what you do when no one is looking." And so are we constantly, as priests and religious, reflecting upon what is it that God is asking me to do in this moment? And then how do I do it to the best of my ability? How do I serve my brothers around me? How do I serve this community? How do I serve the people of God? Is it through prayer? Is it through sacrifice? Is it through service? It's a true, amazing life that we get to live as priests when we find our identity in Jesus Christ. But when we slip and find our identity in the world or worldly things, these are the areas that will draw us away and water down not only our fecundity as priests, but also our power as priests. And so we have the opportunity today for each of us to receive Christ in Holy Communion and ask for that grace to imitate him more fully, to interiorize what it means to be priest victim, priest as sacrifice, to interiorize this invitation to die to self, to strive to eliminate all selfishness out of our own life, and rather to strive a life of selflessness. If we do this, if we truly embrace the cross, if we live for others, if we truly embrace the authentic divine revelation of Jesus Christ, when we die, we will hear the words, "Well done. Well done, my good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your Father's house." So let us receive our Lord today and ask for the grace to live as he did.